For those paying attention, it is obvious that the cultural vanguard has long since moved on from the played-out tropes and predictable strategies of postmodernism. That story is old, and there is, by now, over a decade's worth of academic literature devoted not just to postmodernism's decline, but to what has arisen to succeed it since the early 2000s. While the legacy of postmodernism will of course live on and continue to permeate society, it is hardly the spear point anymore of cultural innovation. Something new is afoot in areas where postmodern forms recently held court. Apparently, the consensus that has emerged among cultural theorists, art critics, sociologists, philosophers, and other social scientists is that this new paradigm bears the label metamodernism, a term which, despite its downsides, is certainly an improvement over the provisional stand-in of postmodernism. But just what specifically characterizes this meta-modern turn in culture? And why does the prefix meta seem to have found such broad appeal, or actually, more than that, independent convergence? For in the short span between 2017 and 2021, for instance, no less than 4 different books were published by different authors of different backgrounds attempting to describe a metamodern successor to the postmodern throne. These included 2017's Metamodernism, Historicity, Affect, and Depth After Postmodernism, an anthology of essays, 2017's The Listening Society, Volume 1 of the Metamodern Guide to Politics series, 2019's Metamodernity, Meaning and Hope in a Complex World, and 2021's Metamodernism, The Future of Theory. Some of these authors were drawing upon and extending the term's use by others, while some came to it independently. We may thus rightly ask, what are these metamodernisms? Is there anything more than shared terminology linking these articulations of what comes after postmodernism? Or is the apparent consensus on a label little more than a superficial similarity, masking a deeper theoretical incoherence? As we shall see, there are without doubt meaningful distinctions in how these writers have understood and applied the term. There are cultural theorists, like Vermeulen and van der Acker, who use metamodernism to speak primarily of developments in art and culture, for whom the label marks a distinct cultural period and structure of feeling, a la Raymond Williams. Some of them, Linda Cirillo and Greg Dember, also refer to it as an episteme, or structure of knowing, a la Foucault. On the other hand, other thinkers like Freinot and Anderson speak of metamodernism as a stage in culture's continual complexification of symbolic codes, including postmodern insights, while also transcending beyond them. Still, others like Storm are proposing metamodernism as a new philosophical paradigm that offers new avenues for thought and research beyond the old deconstructive methods, now reaping diminishing returns in academia. Within this milieu, various thinkers have adopted the term to identify developments in scientific thought and even religious and theological reformulations. Given the diverse domains from which these theorists and adopters of the metamodern have arisen, and the consequent differences in emphasis and areas of focus, it is understandable why some might presume their theories to have little in common. They would be wrong. With this video, I hope to examine the theory of metamodernism, not to further muddy the waters, but in fact to better clarify what metamodernism is by showing how all of the before mentioned are part of the same pattern emerging in cultural consciousness. All forms of the metamodern get their name by affixing the Greek prefix meta to modern, in the same way that its predecessor was delimited by adding post. The meaning of postmodern is relatively straightforward, essentially that which comes after and critiques the modern. The prefix meta, however, is a bit more ambiguous given the different meanings it can have in the original Greek. Meta can mean with, between, or after beyond, as well as some other prepositional relationships depending on the case used for the noun it modifies. The meaning of meta I wish to highlight is not purely etymological, but actually draws on a concept that arose through an intriguing historical accident. The concept I am referring to is the meta of reflexive abstraction. Despite the $10 term reflexive abstraction, this phenomenon should actually be rather familiar to you, as it has recently come into fairly popular usage, not an incidental fact in a metamodern culture. To call something meta, or usually half ironically so meta, means that it is somehow engaged in a self-reflective loop. Say a song about songs, a play about plays, or a film about films. When a writer writes about writing, as in Still Life with Woodpecker, wherein the author repeatedly offers tangential interludes about the typewriter he is using to compose the book you are reading, or a television show depicts itself, as in the episode of Boy Meets World, in which a character goes to Hollywood to play his own role in a show called Kid Gets Acquainted with the Universe. They are going meta. That is, they are nesting a representation of themselves within yet another, higher level representation. They are recursively reflecting on themselves, creating levels within levels, a bit like a funhouse mirror. The historical accident from which this use of meta derives is actually the misunderstanding of the meaning of Aristotle's metaphysics. In the ancient ordering of Aristotle's works, his work on nature, physics, came first, after which came the stuff very appropriately titled After Physics, ta meta, ta physica. The latter dealt with philosophical abstractions like the nature of causality, matter, God, etc. The implication that people drew from this was that there was, physics, about matter and stuff, and metaphysics, about the stuff beyond matter and stuff. Through this rather stupid historical confusion about some pretty intellectual things, we get not only the field of metaphysics, which today refers to any kind of higher order philosophical reflections on what makes the physical world possible, but also the derivative concept of meta as the higher, broader take on a topic, meta as the transcendent concept, per se. Once you know the rule, you can play the game. It can get you meta-psychology, meta-mathematics, you name it. So, from this back formation, Merriam-Webster defines meta as that which is more comprehensive, transcending, specifying that it is usually used with the name of a discipline to designate a new but related discipline designed to deal critically with the original one. So, Wiktionary offers for meta, transcending, encompassing, pertaining to a level above or beyond, reflexive or recursive, about itself or about other things of the same type. For example, metadata is data that describes data. Meta-language is language that describes language, etc. It is in this sense that the author will theorize about the metamodern turn in culture after postmodernism, according to which meta suggests, essentially, recursive transcendence through iterative self-reflection. Simply put, going meta on something means creating a new level of analysis that can deal critically with it from a more transcending, encompassing vantage. This kind of meta follows an identifiable logic. The basic move occurs through a process we can call decentration, whereby a given perspective becomes the object of analysis to an even higher level perspective. To picture this, imagine a circle representing all the contents of a given field of awareness relative to a single central perspective. From one's position in the center, One can look around and see any objects that fill one's horizon from that position, everything bounded within one's circle of awareness. Now imagine stepping outside this bounded circle of awareness to a new vantage, and, from there, obtaining an even wider scope. In doing so, one's center has shifted. One has decentered oneself from the earlier perspective, and from this position, the old, smaller scope now exists within the wider one as an object in one's field. From this broader, higher-level perspective, one can look down and reflect upon one's old perspective. Its limits are now clear, and the entire horizon of the old view now lies within the expanded horizon of the new. A smaller copy of one's old self now exists within the larger whole, a previous perspective residually residing in the new one like a minuscule reflection, a representation of one's older approach to representation. Now imagine this process repeating over and over, iterating on itself again and again, until there are circles within circles within circles, through an endless decentration to higher and higher vantages. This is what it means to really go meta. This process is inherently an evaluative, critical one, since as reflection upon the lower level perspective is compared to the wider scope of the new perspective, it is found wanting. It is now clear how much of the bigger picture was missing from the old view of things. Because of this, going meta comes with critique. The new perspective sees things the old one could not, and is thus newly aware of its deficiencies. However, as the process iterates, even the wider perspective reveals its inadequacies compared to a larger kin, and so on. Because each new iteration and recursive reflection represents an advance towards the greater and more comprehensive vision of the totality, it marks a genuine transcendence to a new order of insight and awareness. Knowledge is gained, and more of provisional reality is revealed. Such is the nature of recursive transcendence through iterative self-reflection. So what am I saying? The claim is that cultural shifts, like those from modernism to postmodernism to metamodernism, reflect society-level manifestations of such recursive, self-reflective moves. Postmodernists come after, objectify, reflect upon, critique, and transcend modernism. Metamodernists come after, objectify, reflect upon, critique, and transcend postmodernism, and so on. As they do, genuinely novel insights and sensibilities are generated that justify speaking in terms of distinct cultural phases. This novelty is the litmus test for assessing a true advance instead of simply some lateral change. That is, recursive self-reflection has a direction. It moves necessarily towards wider, more encompassing perspectives and away from smaller, more parochial ones. Because of this, we see that all formulations of the metamodern have in common an attempt to move beyond postmodernism, yet by means of postmodernism. Any articulation of metamodernism that does not include postmodern insights is not actually metamodern, since it shows no sign of being postmodern. For instance, a critique of postmodernism based on supposed deviations from injunctions in inerrant scripture will almost certainly not be a metamodern critique, but only a reactionary traditionalist one. Similarly, any critique of postmodernism based on its rejection of a technological utopia attained by acquiring ultimate knowledge will almost certainly be but a reactionary modernist plea. Neither actually grapple with the genuine insights of postmodernism, so neither can claim to have surpassed it. By contrast, a critique of postmodernism based on applying a deep understanding of its own critical principles to itself in a manner that produces novel ideas and directions, that would indeed be a metamodern move, since it evinces the ability to master and move beyond that which it critiques. By the nature of its critique, it reveals that it does indeed possess a higher vantage, and so marks an advance beyond postmodernism, metamodernism, and not simply a move back or away from it. various lower forms of anti-postmodernism. In this way, recursive reflection has directionality. Going meta never means diminishing one's scope of perspectives, but always increasing it. By definition, it is what allows one to step outside a given frame to see more of the picture. It is like a person in a painting, climbing out of the painting and then looking back at where they had been encased. Now they can see the whole context of their former position. It was just a painting. They can also see their old context within the broader context of their new vantage, an art gallery. They can see more of the relationships that hold in this context. They see, for instance, that their old context was just a painting, and not the fullness of reality, except the process is iterative, so before long it becomes clear that the reality in which they currently stand is also limited. Transcending again, imagine the person now climbs out of the television and can see the art gallery was itself just in their TV, as the painting was in the art gallery. The TV contains the gallery and the painting, but the painting does not contain the gallery or the TV. The context of the TV contains more than the context of the painting, allowing one a broader view of provisional reality. In short, higher vantages provide more information than lower ones. There is more to reflect on, and so more to inform one's thoughts and actions and feelings. One might compare this to increasing the resolution of one's screen. Upgrading to more reflexive perspectives takes you from a screen of a few pixels, hard to decipher, to the quaint resolution of an 8-bit computer game, all the way to a 4K high-definition TV. Higher and higher resolutions bring more and more information, and show more and more of the picture, making more of the context clearer. Or, even better, one might compare perspectival shifts in terms of gains in dimension, like the one you experience when you upgrade from a 2D film to a 3D one. Now you can see the objects in a higher dimensional plane. Indeed, the geometric logic of increasing dimensions is very much the same as iterative recursive reflection. At each level, the unit of the last level is placed in a higher order organizational context through an orthogonal move to a new vantage, just like decentration. Decentering from the 0D point to a position beyond it establishes a new dimension, the 1D line made up of points. Decentering from the one-dimensional line to a position beyond it establishes the 2D plane, made up of lines and so on. In the process, qualitatively new sets of relations are created. The pluralization of the unit allows for the plurality to be related, linked, connected, defining the parameters of a whole new dimension. New relations mean new kinds of information in richer, more complex forms that contain their earlier, less complex forms. Cubes contain planes which contain lines which contain points, etc. The process is iterative and endless, as every new dimension can become the unit in yet higher n-dimensional space. The fact that such higher vantages contain more information makes them more complex. Complexity refers to the number of integrated parts a thing has. Once a perspective becomes a decentered object of awareness, it becomes but a part in a bigger whole. As a part, its relationship to other parts, for example perspectives, can be assessed. More perspectival parts, integrated in more contextual webs of relation, mark an increase in perspectival complexity. This follows directly from all that we have been saying, yet it leads us to an interesting and perhaps for some startling conclusion. Cultural shifts, like the ones from modernism to postmodernism to metamodernism, are movements of complexification. Metamodernism is not just temporarily after meta, postmodernism. It is beyond meta, it. Metamodernism is a more complex perspective than postmodernism, which was itself a more complex perspective than modernism. Such cultural shifts are not just changes, they are developments. Postmodernism saw more of the picture than the modernists, for example, that minorities were marginalized by its grand narrative, that technological progress also posed systemic existential risks, that a single, final, absolute truth cannot be attained, etc. Now, metamodernists see more of the picture than postmodernists, for example, that grand narratives can be reconstructed according to the infinite deconstruction through eternal recursive reflection and critique, and that this itself provides a logic of meaning and value, etc. Specifically, metamodernists see not just that different cultural logics are at play in the world, this was the insight of the postmodernists. No, metamodernists see, to varying degrees, the logic behind these different cultural logics, the pattern that gives rise to the recognizable typology of different perspectives. What logic is that? The very one I have been outlining here, an algorithmic process of recursive self-reflection by means of which cultural logics become aware of one another, of themselves, and of the very process that generates them. But before metamodernists go getting too big for their britches, it should be clear, the process keeps going. The metamodern perspective is also just another center of perception that one can in turn decenter from, to see a wider context. Just what that looks like will only become clear in time, as metamodernism is itself objectified, reflected upon, critiqued, and transcended. But if metamodernism does indeed reflect something real, then this is unavoidable. In this way, metamodernism presumes its own transcendence. It embraces its own inevitable obsolescence. In doing so, it escapes the triumphalist modernist illusion of ever attaining any sort of final telos or end. Its telos is a receding telos. Its end is an endlessly iterating self-recursion and self-transcendence. This is a key idea, so let's give it a name. Friedrich Nietzsche spoke of eternal recurrence as the core idea grounding his radically immanent philosophy. As a nod to him, while seeking to move ahead, I will suggest eternal recursion as the grounding idea of this eminently transcendent perspective. This eternal recursion is progressive, since it is continually reaching more comprehensive perspectives. At the same time, this progress is paradoxical, since how can one make any progress in an infinite process? The advance is towards a continually receding horizon. There is no final absolute, rendering all gains relative, and yet, in their relativity to one another, their gains are absolute. This sort of paradoxical advance I call infinitesimal progress, movement by means of infinitely diminishing strides, or more grandiosely, Zenonian progress, after the Greek philosopher Zeno and his paradoxes of motion. How does one reach a destination when the ground one must cover is recursively divisible into smaller and smaller parts? The metamodernists, appeasing both modernists and postmodernists, assures, all progress is relative. Progress is real, but it lies in the going. In the words of Emily Dickinson, so instead of getting to heaven, at last I'm going all along.